The First World War. The Industrial Revolution had started in England in the final years of the 18th century. France joined in at the beginning of the 19th century, and Germany since 1870. The steep increase in production led these countries to search for new foreign markets, the African continent being the axle of this economic drive. Nationalism, imperialism, and militarism induced a situation leading in 15 years to many colonial struggles between the three great European powers. They were at the brink of war more than once. Some leaders sought for peace in international congresses, like Tsar Nikolai II of Russia, when in 1899 he attended 26 government's delegates in the city of The Hague, Netherlands, with the aim of finding some recipe to abate tension and armaments. The Congress was a failure, but at least an international arbitration court was instituted, and it still meets today. In 1914, the net of hostile alliances and national rivalries plunged Europe into disaster in a catastrophic war that raved over the 5 continents and put an end to a period called the Armed Peace. They fought all over the world on land, on the sea, and in the air, and the result was the annihilation of 4 empires and the death of more than 15 million people. Moreover, a new world order emerged for so many other human beings. Once the cultural focus of the world, Europe was now so deeply broken by political resentment and racial hatred that a Second World War was clearly seen in the horizon as something unavoidable. Year 1914. The origin of the war. Many things seemed to unify Europe in the hot summer of 1914. Social and cultural structures were similar, and the royal houses were related by blood or marriage. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II was the nephew of King Edward VII of Great Britain and cousin to Russia's Tsar Nikolai. These aristocrats held honorific charges in their armies, a fact that stirred their militarist spirits. On the other hand, in the Balkanic Wars of 1912 and 1913, Serbia had gained territories over Turkey, and therefore their urge for mastering the Slavic lands under Austro-Hungarian rule north of the Adriatic was kindled. This affair biased the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the weakest central power, against the Serbians. At the same time, the losers in these wars, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, nurtured their desire for vengeance. In Germany, the enthronement of the new emperor, Wilhelm II, had led to the fall of Chancellor Bismarck and a steep turn in the government's foreign policy. In addition to that, the fact that a united Germany had quickly risen in the world order among the industrialized nations was a great source of worry for some powers. In that, France appeared particularly relentless. There was still a deep resentment against Germany for the humiliating defeat against Prussia in 1870 and the consequent loss of land in Alsace and Lorraine. The great France's ally, Russia, felt also threatened by the rising of Germany, thinking it dangerous for its lead in Central and Eastern Europe. As it is, Great Britain stayed away from its neighbors' quarrels. It was considered the greatest colonial power and felt safe under the eminence of the Empire and the Commonwealth. Nevertheless, they watched closely the growing German militarism and felt sore about its ally, the Ottoman Empire, losing its European territories in the Balkanic War. Besides, Wilhelm II insisted in seizing a seat of great influence among the most important nations of the world and would not hesitate to use the military force to make his efforts bear. Most parts of Germany are away from the sea, and the Kaiser was deeply jealous of the British Royal Navy. He decided to create a fleet that could be a match for it. For this program, he found an enthusiastic follower in Admiral von Tirpitz, who spared no effort to make the Kaiser's wishes true once they decided to dramatically increase the budget assigned to the military. This fact made the British apprehensive enough to introduce in 1905 the battleship HMS Dreadnought, built and launched in 4 months. This new kind of man of war meant a giant step for the Royal Navy and granted a large superiority over its rivals. Its £3 million cost had put His Majesty's government at pains. This presentation was an enticement for the armaments race, for all the navies in the world understood that battleships to be the future of sea power. It was clear enough that the British had the will to sustain their supremacy at sea, while the Germans spared no efforts to get even. Surprise was paramount when in 1913 the English Navy introduced another kind of super battleship, the Queen Elizabeth type. This ship carried 15-inch guns, the largest of the kind in the world, and therefore could fire its broadsides at a long range. It was relatively swift, being the first man-of-war to use diesel-powered engines. Its arrival at sea quickened dizzily the armaments race, when the other countries' navies appealed for these new battleships to their governments. Tension heightened in Europe under the belief that future, or assumed to be so, enemies had long since drawn the war plans, leaving nothing to chance, including exact timings for the troops' moves and inventories of carefully chosen objectives. The communications network by rail or road was the axle of the plan. For in the French-Prussian War, Prussians had been efficiently mobilized along the railway lines. They used it to swiftly send troops wherever they needed them, while French trains stayed trapped in their own stations for lack of infrastructures. To top it all, the 1893 military treaty between France and Russia had very much distressed the Chief of High Staff of the time, Count Alfred von Schlieffen. Pondering the potential danger for Germany of making war on 2 fronts, Eastern and Western, he devised a plan made known in 1905. The plan minutely detailed how to mobilize 1 million men to crush France in 42 days. Then, they would turn east to defeat the Russians. It assumed that Russia would take all that time to get moving due to its huge size. The key element for the plan's success was a combined assault from eastern France, while the main bodies swept through Belgium and Luxembourg to the northeast of Paris. Belgium's neutrality was supposed to be secured by an 1839 treaty signed by Great Britain and Germany, among others. In the pre-war years, Schleifen's successor, General Helmut von Moltke, altered the Count's original plan. The Count was so haunted by his plan that his last words were, "Don't forget to strengthen the right flank." The knowledge of the Schleifen's plan set the French in a frenzy for scheming a series of war plans whose climax was attained by the 17th Plan. Its main objective was to retrieve Alsace and Lorraine. Thanks to their recruitment policies, France and Germany, two European great countries, had two great armies. The use of these armies in the colonial drive and the existence of secret war plans filled the situation with distrust and strain. When the mobilization order was issued in these countries, more than 3 million men joined up. It was a general belief among military and political leaders, and indeed among the public, that once set in motion, troops transport was an unstoppable machine. The mobilization order was considered a declaration of war, not a sheer preliminary. With such a restlessness in the area, it was just a question of time for some event to kindle a European war. At the time, it was assumed that it would not last more than some weeks or months at the most. Nobody figured the 5 years of hardships and destruction that were yet to come. The spark that set ablaze the war was kindled on Sunday, June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia, were paying an official visit to Sarajevo, Bosnia's capital. The 19-year-old young Serbian student Gavrilo Princip was the member of a Serbian-Bosnian nationalist group called the Black Hand. He saw in this deed a sudden chance to attract attention on his nationalist cause. When the imperial couple's car was passing by, young Gavrilo aimed his gun and shot twice, killing Franz Ferdinand and his wife. If Austria had made an immediate move, probably the rest of Europe would have stood by it. But the hesitating Austrian reaction came 4 weeks later. On July the 23rd, 1914, after several meetings with Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was an ultimatum including 10 conditions, 8 of which the Serbians, duly entreated by Russia and Great Britain, immediately accepted, while proffering to submit the other 2 to the Hague Court. Austria retorted on July the 25th that the Serbian answer was not satisfactory and declared war on the 28th. Russia's answer, by order of the Tsar Nikolai II and his war minister, the Great Duke Nikolai, was to mobilize the army to help their Serbian ally. The Germans had signed with Italy and Austria the Triple Alliance Compact, so they granted their support to the Austrians and thus began their mobilization. They requested from France, Russia's and Great Britain's ally to remain neutral and try to stop Russians' preliminaries. As a token of goodwill, they would yield to the French the border strongholds they had been claiming. France refused and ordered the mobilization in the last hour of July the 31st. Sunday, August the 2nd, the German troops took over Luxembourg. Monday, August the 3rd, the Germans declared war on France. Meanwhile, the Belgians refused a German request to cross over their country. In Great Britain, it was a holiday, and many people had gone out, unaware of the looming disaster, only getting it in sight when they read the mobilization order. On Tuesday the 4th, the German army declared war on Belgium, and the Schlieffen Plan was put into action with this country's invasion along a narrow front. Great Britain, Belgium's ally, requested an immediate surrender from the Germans. But Chancellor Bethmann Hulwig simply ignored this request, assuming that the Anglo-Belgian Treaty was just waste paper. At 11 p.m., the British government declared war on Germany. The same day, the U.S. government stated their neutrality. France mobilized more than 1,700,000 men, enlisted them in 5 armies, and sent them to the northeast borderline. Germany sent 1,500,000 men to the French-Belgian border and ordered the cruisers Goeben and Breslau to attack French Algeria's harbors. 200,000 men were sent to East Prussia as protection against a Russian offensive. The Russians did not wish to wait to mobilize their troops, and they marched against East Prussia with 2 armies amounting to 300,000 men each. Having a smaller army, the British did not take long to organize and sent to France their expeditionary force. 2 battalions and a cavalry division amounting in full to 150,000 men. They arrived in France on August the 7th, marched to Belgium, and took their positions around Mons. The military operation started in 3 fronts: the Western or French-Belgian front, the Southern or Serbian front, and the Eastern or Russian front. The German strategy, relying on a quick French defeat under the Schlieffen Plan's Blitzkrieg, suffered a heavy delay due to the strong resistance in Liège, Namur, and particularly Antwerp of the small Belgian army of 200,000 men. The Germans derisively dubbed them the Chocolate Soldiers. The Kaiser's soldiers were forced to use huge bombs to crush the Belgian fortresses. They suffered many casualties, and this had serious consequences in the following weeks for their right flank. The greatest campaign of the war began with the border battles of the Western Front on August the 8th, 1914. According to Joseph Joffre's 17th plan, the French launched 5 offensives. The first aimed at the city of Mulhouse in Alsace and was led by General Paul Pau. The fight along the French and Belgian borders lasted 10 days, and the cost raised to 300,000 French soldiers dead. The battles of Mulhouse, Lorraine, Ardennes, Charleroi, and Mons began almost simultaneously and enacted the clash between the French 17th Plan, schemed by General Joffre, and Count Schlieffen's plan. The French marched on to their first assaults with raised colors, music band, and fixed bayonets. The first assaults on Mulhouse and Lorraine were a success, but German tactics were set on luring the French infantry in ambushes, where it could be annihilated by machine guns and heavy artillery fire. The German command arranged successfully the counterattack, so the French were pushed back to their starting positions. The French innovative reconnaissance units found out the German strategy, so ground command could make provision for a successful defense. Meanwhile, the Germans launched a counterattack in Lorraine and in the Ardennes, a thickly wooded area across the French-Belgian border, north of Metz. Two French armies marching to Belgium run into the Germans crossing through Luxembourg and southeast Belgium. In the ensuing fierce battles, the French, outnumbered, had serious losses. In particular, General Ruffy's Third Army and General Fernand de Langle's Fourth Army were almost wiped out. They were forced to withdraw to their positions between the Meuse and Marne, with their right flank resting on the Verdun stronghold. On August 12, 1914, 200,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers, led by General Potiorik, invaded Serbia, prompting the Battle of River Jadar. Serbian soldiers under the command of Marshal Putnik forced them to withdraw. On August the 16th, the embittered painter and actor born in Austria, Adolf Hitler, volunteered to fight with the German army where he was assigned courier tasks and gained several awards for valor. On August the 23rd, the Japanese government declared war on Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and launched an attack on Tsingtao, a German colony in China. In the third clash of the Battle of the Borders at Charleroi, the Germans won their first undisputable victory over the 5th French Army under General Lanrezac. He had anticipated that the Germans would entrench themselves in Belgium, but his high commander Joffre ordered him to take positions between the rivers Sambre and Meuse in order to stop the main German drive. While this clash was being fought, German shells razed the garrison at Namur, and the city fell to them on August the 25th, 1914. Lanrezac hoped that the British Expeditionary Force would take its positions to support them, but the Germans ran faster and secured 2 bridges over the River Sambre, an action paralyzing the French troops. After 2 days of hard struggle, the French had suffered too many losses, and in the west their lines began to collapse, endangering the British task force's right flank posted in Mons and already at fierce blows with the 1st German Army under General von Kluck. Lanrezac and the remains of his 5th Army were forced to withdraw, and this probably saved the French army from complete destruction. Facing the humiliating defeat, General Joffre chose Lanrezac for a scapegoat, blaming him for all the French mistakes, including those in his own 17th plan. The British had deployed 2 infantry corps on a 14-mile front to the east and west of Mons. Facing the canal and with their eastern leg almost reaching the retreating French Fifth Army. The Germans hoped to break the British task force's lines under the command of Sir John French. The British used the Lee Enfield rifle, able to make accurately 15 shots per minute. As a result, the Germans were downed by the thousands. In fact, many of them stated that the British had many machine guns. Such was their fire speed and accuracy. British casualties were also serious, and Sir John French ordered the withdrawal the minute he knew what had happened to Lanrezac's army, and that the merging was now impossible. Faced with their own dead and wounded high figures, the Germans decided not to chase them. After this defeat, the British and French retreated to the Paris outskirts. In view of this fact, von Moltke, chief of the German High Staff, changed again the Schlieffen Plan and ordered his northeast troops to march against the French capital. On August the 26th, this maneuver forced the 2nd British Task Corps under General Smith-Dorrien, 40,000 exhausted men, to fight the German troops at Les Cateaux. The oddly dubbed musketeer capacities of the British infantry showed again. The German march was held back, just enough time for the Allies to reorganize and send the 5th French Army under General Louis Franchet to relieve the pressure on the British attacking and stopping for a while General von Bülow's troops. On August the 28th, 1914, the British naval forces sank 3 German cruisers off Helgoland, a North Sea island. In that action, the British found themselves in trouble when they were outnumbered by German ships. They could save the day only thanks to Admiral David Beatty's ships rushing 40 miles from the north. The Germans lost 1,200 men for only 35 losses to the British. As a result of that action, Beatty strengthened his reputation as a great naval strategist. East of the River Marne, between Paris and Verdun, the exhausted British and French armies launched a new counterattack. The key action in the Marne offensive, known as the Battle of the Ourcq, was the attack of the 6th French Army of General Joseph Gallieni, Paris's military governor, against the unprotected right flank of the 1st German Army under General von Kluck to the east of Paris on September the 6th, 1914. The undefended German right flank gave way to a 25-mile breach, soon capitalized by the Allies. Von Kluck was positive that the French attack was a diversion maneuver, so he didn't send many reinforcements and kept on marching with his soldiers towards the south, chasing the remains of the British expeditionary troops. On September the 7th, von Kluck realized his mistake and ordered his troops to turn back across the Marne and head west to engage the French 7th Army under General Michel Manroy, who was surprised by the German attack. Manroy, growing desperate for the lack of reinforcements, the French command sent to the front 6,000 soldiers from the Paris Reserve in 600 taxicabs. Meanwhile, the British task force swarmed through the gap and turned east to launch a heavy assault on the German Second Army's right flank in what was known since as the Battle of Du Morin. On September the 8th, the gap was widened by a surprise attack of Ferdinand Foch's 5th French Army against von Bülow's 2nd German Army. Attacks and counterattacks in the Marne region, driven by one side or the other, lasted for 3 days. The bloody clashes in the Vitry-le-François and the Argonne forest were matched by the offensives in Alsace-Lorraine, southeast of Verdun. Pondering the possibility of a great British attack on his weakest flank, the German Chief of High Staff, Helmut von Moltke, ordered Kluck to withdraw his troops to a line between Noyon and Verdun, besides the river Oise. The German withdrawal put an end to the Battle of the Marne. Its 6 stages were considered so many strategic successes by the French and British because they could drive the German offensive back and regain some of the land they had lost in the previous weeks. This offensive put an end to the German hopes of a quick outcome of the war in the Western Front, as suggested by the Schlieffen Plan. Now, their worst nightmare, war on 2 fronts, had come true. The so singular movements of troops were finished too. From then on, both sides encamped in the soon-to-be familiar trench warfare. Costs had been high for both armies. The French had 250,000 casualties. The Germans, 220,000, and the British lost 13,000 men. In the Eastern Front, 2 Russian armies assailed eastern Prussia at the beginning of August 1914. The Second Army, under General Alexander Samsonov, marched from the southeast, and the First Army of General Parel Rennenkampf did the same from the northwest. The Russian plan was to throw the First Army against the 8th German Army under General Max von Prittwitz for a head-on assault, while Samsonov's army surrounded the Germans in spite of the long distance and the rugged region of the Masurian Lakes. The campaign started well, but Rennenkampf hated Samsonov, and his personal vendetta brought about a dreadful defeat for the Russians in Staluponin, where they lost 3,000 men. On August the 20th, General Max von Prittwitz was discharged, and General Paul von Hindenburg took over, appointing for his Chief of High Staff the aggressive General Erich Ludendorff, the man who had taken Liège in Belgium. The Germans knew about the conflict between the 2 Russian commanders, and after catching the radio messages sent by both armies, they had precise knowledge of all their plans. In Orlau-Frankenau, south of Prussia, both armies were engaged in a fierce battle, enabling the Germans to concentrate their troops near the town of Tannenberg and to set an ambush for the unsuspecting Samsonov. On August the 29th, the Germans surrounded on 3 sides Samarov's Second Army and destroyed it, taking 95,000 prisoners and killing more than 30,000 Russian troops. This fact made the Allies drop the invasion of Eastern Prussia and raised serious doubts in England and France about the Russian army's capability. Samsonov committed suicide rather than facing the dishonor of having to report the disaster. Tannenberg forged the reputation of two German generals who were to play an essential role in the war, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. When the fact was known at the end of August, the Austro-Hungarian army launched an offensive against 4 Russian armies. There ensuing several battles, like the Battle of Samos Kamarov or Ganina Lipa, with no remarkable results for any side, each keeping its stand. At that time, the German General Liman von Sanders was appointed Supreme Commander of the 1st Turkish Army. The battles in the first month of the war had particularly hit the exhausted British Expeditionary Force. The British Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, believed that the war would last at least 3 years and would not be over by Christmas, as it was generally said. He thought essential to enlist more soldiers in the army. The government refused to endorse Kitchener's recruitment proposal, so he decided to profit by the popular patriotism that had swept the country at the outbreak of the war. In the beginning, he gathered 100,000 volunteers, thanks to one of the most celebrated advertisements in history. Your king and country need you. Men came en masse to the draft offices, and thanks to this success, Kitchener was able to remove the 100,000 limit. By the end of 1914, more than 500,000 men had answered the call. The new recruits were not assimilated in new regiments, but rather in new battalions. At the end of the war, some British regiments had more than 40 battalions, and in many of them the men shared an interest or a trade or came from the same town or village. They were known as the PALS battalions, and although this policy of keeping the men together could have played an important part in the troops' esprit de corps, the high casualties rate left the whole localities without men. The main problem with the new Kitchener's armies was equipment, clothes, and training. Most of the academy officers had been sent up to France, so the veterans' proffering of help was willingly accepted, even if their knowledge was a little outmoded. Other officers came from the private school's training corps. They were assigned provisional tasks and were known as the regulars, or, more derisively, the provisional knights. Rifle supply was slow, too, and in the first series of exercises, they had to use broomsticks. In France, the British Expeditionary Force was fighting in the new warfare style. The parallel lines of the trenches, with their communications and barbed wire defenses, became a part of the French landscape from the Swiss border to the North Sea in Belgium, along more than 500 miles. Each side occasionally raided the enemy's lines, aiming to break them, but getting bogged down in a war of attrition. The soldiers had to take positions in the hills, rear slopes, because digging the trenches in the front slopes made them an easy shot for the enemy's artillery observers. Since the autumn of 1914, war on the Western Front seemed to be stirring a bit. Every army started a series of maneuvers, trying to drive north and weaken the enemy. These moves were known as the race to the sea. The result was a new stalemate, where the British forces ultimately froze in the old Belgian city of Ypres, a word unpronounceable to most of the British privates, who made it generally known as wipers. The name became another word for death and destruction, and the setting for some of the worst battles in the Western Front. The surrounding lands were flat and swampy under a waterlogged weather. It was impossible to drain the trenches or make them deeper without finding any more water. The high ground had been taken by the Germans, leaving the British position so exposed to enemy fire that they had to raise canvas screens in order to conceal the troops' movements. Both sides were unable to make any progress in France, so the Germans decided to break through Ypres, the British sector. The British knew they had no reserve troops behind that should the Germans manage to break their lines, they would probably take the Channel harbors, thus preventing the landing of troops and supplies from Great Britain. In the first stage of what is known as the Battle of Ypres, the 1st British Corps, under General Sir Douglas Haig, stopped the Germans from its positions surrounding Ypres. But their counterattack sank into failure when the hard rains turned the Flemish lowlands into swamps, filled with thousands of corpses from both sides. The 4th and 6th German armies posted around Ypres were reinforced with large amounts of soldiers to grant a success in breaking their way through to the harbors of Calais and Boulogne. More soldiers and more artillery started the new German offensive at the end of October 1914, but they found in the British and French troops a fierce resistance. Several German offensives failed in a row until the first snows came by mid-November, putting an end to the First Battle of Ypres. The Kaiser had ordered his troops to trample over the despicable and old-fashioned army of General French. And that was a lasting honor. Since then, to be a despicable, old-fashioned was a title bestowing respect. Like it happened in England, the Germans had felt a surge of patriotic enthusiasm at the outbreak of the war. The universities were deserted as thousands of young idealists volunteered for a war that had to correct many wrongs in their view. Thousands of them died in Ypres, shot down by British rifles, while they were marching on by ranks like in a military parade. Kids Massacre was a headline in the German press. Both sides, exhausted and frustrated in their attempts to progress, stopped to lick their wounds. Some soldiers were granted some days' leaves, but it was obvious enough that the war would not be over by Christmas. In 1914, the Austrian army attacked Serbia 3 times and was 3 times pushed back. At the beginning of November, the German base of Qingdao in China surrendered to the Japanese. Since the outbreak of the war, Admiral Maximilian von Spee was in charge of the German ships in the Asian Far East. His mission there was assaulting the merchant ships sailing the South Hemisphere. Spee's outfit was led by the armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and included 3 light cruisers, all of them new-built and fast. On November the 1st, in Kernel, off the Chile coast where they had sailed for coal supplies, they engaged the British fleet under Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock. The British squadron was severely defeated. The British lost several ships and crews and their very admiral. Radio transmissions picked up by the British showed that Spee was planning new assaults on freight ships sailing the Atlantic in order to sever the supply routes to Great Britain. The British High Staff quickly sent a ship's outfit under Vice Admiral Sir Frederick Sturdy to the South Atlantic in order to stop the German ships. This squadron included 2 new and fast battle cruisers, the Invincible and the Inflexible, and 6 other light cruisers. Spee's plan included destroying the British coal and radio facilities of Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, where he was bound to. The British squadron was first to pull in and waited for him. When he saw the size of the British force, the German admiral ordered his ships to sail back and was chased by the battleships Inflexible and Invincible. But Sturdy's warships were faster and better rigged, and therefore the German ships soon found themselves in a desperate position under a rain of fire that eventually sent all the German ships, except the battleship Dresden, to the bottom. Ten British sailors were killed in this action, but none of their ships were seriously damaged. However, 2,200 German sailors were killed or drowned in the fight. It was a complete revenge. Meanwhile, in France, the Allies were scheming their first offensive since the beginning of the Trenches War in autumn. The positions were more or less deeply rooted, but Marshal Joffre, the French High Commander, was keen on winning a quick war. The offensive would be launched against the whole line of trenches, from Nieuport in Belgium to Verdun, through the regions of Artois and Champagne. In any case, the winter offensive was aimed at the German party in Saône, in the middle of France, and another smaller party more to the south, at Saint-Mihiel. Joffre's plan was to bump the German army outnumbering the Seance party from the north and south. A subsequent attack on the Ardennes would cut their retreat. A series of small assaults began on December the 10th, followed by greater attacks since the 20th. But outnumbered at all, the Germans were also very well entrenched. Once again, they proved the prevalence of defensive war over the Allied troops' offensive capability. The English and French command believed that the infantry power would prevail, especially because they thought that the offensives against the Russians in the Eastern Front would force to withdraw battalions from France. But in fact, the soldiers' attacks against the German machine gun defended positions were always a failure. By mid-November, the German Ninth Army of General Mackensen crushed General Rennenkampf's First Russian Army and surrounded the Second in the city of Lodz. The Russians were able to set a counterattack, cutting off the German army of General von Schäfer. But the answer was 9 days of strife, resulting in the Germans breaking the siege and making 20,000 Russian prisoners. They also took their artillery pieces, thus nullifying the Russian plan for taking over Silesia, the German industrial region. On December 29th, the Russian general Vorontsov was able to stop the Turkish progress in the Caucasus in the Battle of Sarikamish, but the front stayed open. As Christmas got nearer, the thoughts of the entrenched soldiers in both sides were bent towards home. August's empty optimism, when everybody thought the war would be over by Christmas, gave way to the belief that war would probably last very much longer. Once victory's morale was destroyed, it was time to think about the sense of a ruthless conflict. On Christmas Day, soldiers of both sides left the trenches and met in the no man's land to share cigarettes and good wishes. This was something the soldiers always did in history, but it was especially poignant then, due to the previous massacres they had shared before. Although the officers of the highest ranks tried to stop this fraternization, the Christmas truce, as it was known, lasted the whole day in some sections. They even planted Christmas trees along the trench lines. But when the celebration was over, the troops went back to their positions and went on with the war, maybe with the hopes of being at home for next Christmas.